All right, so we got a really interesting question from a listener, and knowing, how important the Catholic faith is to them is one that I think deserves a deep dive. So the question is, was Sir Francis Drake, this English privateer, the guy who just seemed to always one-up the Spanish, was he really in league with the devil? Did he actually, strike some kind of bargain with the dark side to achieve all those incredible things he did? We've got a biography of the man himself, and even a website dedicated to Drake's hidden treasure. So hopefully we can kind of unpack all this.
Yeah, you've hit on something really, really fascinating there. It's amazing how history, faith, and legend, they all just get intertwined in Drake's story. We probably won't find like a literal signed contract with Satan, tucked away in some dusty archive somewhere. But we can look at Drake's life, we can look at his actions, and we can look at the context of the time that he lived in and see how this idea of him being in league with the devil, how that idea took root and why it continues to fascinate people even today.
Yeah, it's a great way to put it. We have to remember that Drake lived in a world that was vastly different from our own. So let's start with his early life. The biography paints a really vivid picture of the religious tensions of the time and how those tensions shaped his entire outlook on the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So Drake's father was a Protestant, and he actually had to flee Catholic persecution in England. I mean, just imagine the impact that had on young Francis, right? Growing up with these stories of fear, stories of his family having to flee, having to escape persecution. It instilled in him a really deep resentment, I would say, not just towards Catholicism, but also towards figures like King Philip of Spain and the Pope, who were seen as symbols of this Catholic power structure.
Yeah, and that's something I hadn't really considered before. It wasn't just, abstract theological differences for Drake. It was deeply personal. It was rooted in his own family's experience.
Yeah, exactly. And this animosity that he felt, it was just further fueled by events like the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France. I mean, this was a horrific event. Thousands of Protestants were slaughtered. And this, kind of solidified in Drake's mind that Catholicism was a threat to be confronted, and ultimately a threat to be vanquished.
Yeah, it's hard to fathom that level of religious violence today.
Yeah.
But it was a stark reality in Drake's time. It makes you wonder how much of this early life experience, how much of it shaped his actions later on.
Right.
Particularly against the Spanish.
I think it undoubtedly played a very significant role for Drake confronting the Spanish. It wasn't just about national rivalry, right? It was almost like a personal crusade, fueled by this lifetime of, ingrained religious animosity.
And this is where his daring exploits come into play, right? I mean, we're talking raids on Spanish settlements, captures of treasure ships, and even that incredible feat of circumnavigating the globe is like something out of an adventure novel.
His exploits were legendary. There's no doubt about that. They really captured the imagination of the English people. Take, for instance, his audacious raid on Nombre de Dios in Panama. He almost captured an entire treasure caravan. I mean, can you imagine? Narrowly missing out on an unimaginable fortune.
That must have been incredibly frustrating, to be so close to such riches and to have them slip away. Do you think that just fueled his determination even further?
Oh, I think it's very likely. And, he didn't have to wait long for his chance at Spanish treasure. The following year, he captured the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción. It was a Spanish treasure galleon, absolutely loaded with gold, silver, and jewels. I mean, this haul alone made him one of the wealthiest men in England.
It's astounding to think about the sheer scale of these riches. No wonder he became such a celebrated figure in England.
Precisely. But remember, while the English saw him as a hero, this daring adventurer, the Spanish viewed him very, very differently. To them, he was El Drac, the dragon. A fearsome pirate who preyed on their ships and settlements. Some even went so far as to call him the devil, because of his seemingly uncanny ability to always outmaneuver and defeat them.
That contrast in perception is just fascinating. The same man, seen as a champion by one side and a demonic figure by the other. It really speaks to the power of perspective and propaganda, especially in times of conflict.
Absolutely. And it's precisely this dichotomy, this clash between, national narratives and religious beliefs that contributes to this enduring question, this question of whether Drake's successes were divinely ordained or perhaps, as some whispered, aided by darker forces.
So we've got this incredibly complex figure, a devout Protestant, fueled by ambition, national pride, and a deep-seated hatred of Spain. His actions were seen as heroic by his countrymen, but villainous by his enemies.
And it's within this complexity, this ambiguity, that the seeds of the deal with the devil legend were sown. After all, how else could a man achieve such seemingly impossible feats? Defying death, amassing incredible wealth.
It's a question that people have grappled with for centuries. And to really understand it, I think we need to delve deeper into the events that cemented this perception of Drake, this perception of him as a potentially devil-assisted figure. What are some of the specific incidents that stand out?
You mentioned earlier some specific events, specific events in Drake's life that might have contributed to those whispers about him having a deal with the devil. So maybe let's unpack those a little bit. One that immediately comes to mind is the troublesome voyage. It's a really harrowing tale of survival, but it also raises some uncomfortable questions about Drake's actions and his motivations.
Right, because while Drake is often celebrated as this daring adventurer, this voyage really shines a light on a much darker side of his career. The sources we have, they really paint a vivid picture of the horrific conditions that the crew endured after a Spanish attack. We're talking starvation, desperation, and even cannibalism.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder of the brutality of that era and the lengths that people would go to in order to survive. Hawkins, he set sail with 6 ships, including 2 large vessels from the Royal Navy. Drake was actually in command of the Judith, which was one of the smaller ships, and their goal was to acquire enslaved Africans and sell them in the Spanish West Indies.
But King Philip of Spain had actually forbidden trade with the English, so there was already a lot of tension brewing, and then on top of that, they faced fierce storms and attacks from the Spanish.
It's hard to imagine the fear and desperation they must have felt.
They ended up trapped at the port of San Juan de Ulua, near Veracruz. It's actually quite ironic considering this port housed a vast treasure that was awaiting transport back to Spain, the very kind of treasure that Drake was known for pursuing. Yeah, that is a bit of historical irony, isn't it? So here they are, trapped in enemy territory with a massive Spanish fleet nearby and rumors of unimaginable riches just within reach. What happened next?
Well, a tense agreement was reached. The Spanish ships moored alongside the English, but the peace didn't last. The Spanish, fearing that the English might be after their treasure, or perhaps suspecting their intentions with the enslaved people they carried, they launched a surprise attack.
Oh, wow. That sounds like a complete betrayal of trust. It must have been utter chaos.
It was a brutal battle. 2 English ships were sunk, and the Jesus, which was one of the main vessels, it was so badly damaged that it had to be abandoned. Hawkins and some of his crew managed to escape on the Minion, but it was severely overcrowded. Many were left behind, facing a grim fate at the hands of the Spanish.
Yeah, the sources describe the survivors resorting to eating hides, cats, dogs, rats, anything they could find to stave off starvation. It's a chilling testament to the horrors they endured.
Drake, aboard the Judith, managed to escape as well. He reached Plymouth 5 days ahead of Hawkins, and he carried with him letters detailing the disaster to the Queen's Council. This troublesome voyage had a profound impact on Drake. It really shaped his views on the Spanish, and it likely fueled his desire for revenge.
Yeah, it's a bleak chapter in his life.
Yeah.
And it certainly adds another layer to our understanding of his motivations. While the English may have celebrated his victories, they were often achieved at a great cost, both to his enemies and to his own men.
The troublesome voyage also adds, I think, a layer of complexity to this whole deal with the devil notion. Some might argue that a man who endured such suffering, who witnessed such brutality, might be more inclined to make desperate choices, even pacts with dark forces, to achieve his goals.
It's a thought-provoking point. And we've talked about, Drake's hatred of the Spanish and Catholicism. And this voyage, with its betrayal and suffering, it probably solidified those feelings even further.
Absolutely. But it's important to remember that this was a time when the slave trade, while abhorrent to us today, was viewed differently. We need to try to analyze Drake within the context of his time, without condoning his actions.
Right. We're not here to judge him by modern standards, but to understand how he was perceived in his own time. And this voyage, with its violence and suffering, it certainly contributed to the mixed perceptions of Drake, even in England.
Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about Drake's most famous exploit, his circumnavigation of the globe. This voyage, from 1577 to 1580, really solidified his place in history, but it also fueled both the admiration and the fear that he inspired.
It's a mind-boggling feat when you think about the navigational challenges of the time. It's almost hard to believe he pulled it off. How did it even come about?
Well, Drake felt that Spain owed him reparations for the losses he suffered during that troublesome voyage. However, Queen Elizabeth, while sympathetic to Drake's plight, she was hesitant to engage in open war with Spain. So Drake, ever the bold adventurer, decided to take matters into his own hands.
He essentially went rogue, didn't he? Attacking Spanish ships and settlements without a formal declaration of war. I mean, that's piracy, isn't it?
That's how the Spanish saw it, of course. But Drake framed his actions as justified retribution. Retribution for the wrongs he and other English sailors had suffered. He saw his life as striking back against this Catholic Spanish Empire, which he viewed as a tyrannical force.
It's fascinating how he managed to spin his actions as patriotic service to his queen, even though they were essentially acts of piracy. It speaks to his charisma and his ability to manipulate perceptions.
And remember, this was a time when the lines between privateering and piracy were often blurred. Queen Elizabeth, while not officially sanctioning Drake's actions, certainly benefited from the riches that he brought back to England.
Right. It was a win-win for her. She could distance herself from the more unsavory aspects of Drake's exploits while reaping the rewards. But let's talk about those rewards for a moment. The website dedicated to Drake's hidden treasure, it paints a picture of incredible riches acquired during this voyage.
It does. Drake raided Spanish ports along the Pacific coast of South America. He captured treasure ships, and he even made off with a massive silver cross from a cathedral in Panama. He returned to England laden with treasures that made him one of the wealthiest men in the country.
It's almost like something out of a pirate movie, isn't it? This daring voyage, incredible escapes, and mountains of gold and silver. It's no wonder people started attributing his success to supernatural forces.
Exactly. He returned to England a hero, he was knighted by the Queen, but to the Spanish he was a devilish figure, a phantom who seemed to strike at will and vanish without a trace. His exploits became legendary, and those legends, fueled by fear and awe, contributed to this notion that he might have had some otherworldly assistance.
So we've got this backdrop of religious tension, personal vendetta, incredible feats of daring, and of course, the whispers of dark forces at play. That's a captivating story, but there's still more to uncover, right? What are some of the darker accusations levied against Drake that really cemented this idea of a deal with the devil?
Well, one event that really stands out is the execution of Thomas Doughty during Drake's circumnavigation voyage. Doughty was a gentleman adventurer who had joined the expedition, but he quickly clashed with Drake. He was accused of treason and mutiny, charges that, could have jeopardized the entire voyage.
Yeah, the biography goes into some detail about this. It mentions that Doughty was kind of a controversial figure from the start, even before they set sail. And some accounts even suggest that he may have been envious of Drake's command, and maybe even plotted to undermine him.
That's right. Drake accused Doughty of trying to sabotage the expedition and, sow discord among the crew. And remember, they were in uncharted territory facing incredible dangers. Maintaining order and discipline was absolutely paramount.
It's hard to imagine the tension on board that ship. Thousands of miles from home, surrounded by hostile forces. And then this internal conflict erupts. It must have felt like a powder keg ready to explode.
It was a very high-stakes situation, and Drake, after holding a trial right there on a remote island off the coast of South America, found Doughty guilty and condemned him to death.
A trial on a deserted island. A dramatic execution. It sounds like something out of a Shakespearean play. How did it all go down?
Well, the method of execution itself is quite striking. Doughty received communion alongside Drake, kind of a gesture of reconciliation, and then he was beheaded.
Wow, it's a chilling scene to imagine. It must have sent shockwaves through the crew. To witness your captain executing one of your own in such a dramatic fashion, it certainly reinforces that image of Drake as a ruthless, uncompromising leader.
Exactly. For Drake supporters, this execution, it was a necessary act to maintain order and ensure the success of the mission. But for his detractors, it was seen as evidence of his cold-blooded ambition, his willingness to eliminate rivals by any means necessary.
And of course, this event just added fuel to the fire of those deal with the devil rumors. I mean, executing a fellow Englishman, a gentleman no less, on a remote island. It's the kind of act that, easily lends itself to those darker interpretations.
Absolutely. And Doughty's brother back in England, he actually accused Drake of orchestrating the entire affair to get rid of a potential threat. He claimed that it was murder, driven by personal spite and a lust for power.
So you have this controversial execution, the amassing of incredible wealth, Drake's constant escapes from Spanish traps, his almost superhuman ability to navigate uncharted waters. It's not hard to see how, in the context of that time, you might start to whisper about supernatural forces being involved.
And remember, this was an era steeped in religious fervor and superstition. Belief in the devil and the power of dark forces was widespread. And Drake's exploits, his triumphs against a Catholic empire, his seeming invincibility, it all contributed to this growing unease, a sense that something otherworldly was at play.
Yeah, it's like a perfect storm of circumstances, isn't it? You have Drake's actions, the perceptions of those around him, the religious climate of the time, all converging to create this enduring legend.
Exactly. And it's a legend that continues to fascinate us even today. Did Drake make a deal with the devil? Ultimately, we can't say for sure. The historical record doesn't offer any conclusive evidence, but the fact that this question persists centuries after his death really speaks volumes about the enduring power of his story.
Yeah, it's a reminder that history is often as much about perception and interpretation as it is about facts and events. Drake's life was a tapestry woven with threads of ambition, courage, ruthlessness, and perhaps a touch of the supernatural.
He was a product of his time, a complex and contradictory figure who embodied both the aspirations and the anxieties of a nation on the rise. His story challenges us to grapple with the complexities of the past, to understand how individuals are shaped by the forces of their era, and to recognize that even the most celebrated heroes can cast long shadows.
So for our listener, who you know is struggling with this question, given their devout Catholic faith, what do you think is the most important takeaway from all of this?
I think the most important takeaway is that Drake, like all historical figures, needs to be understood within the context of his time. He was a man driven by ambition, shaped by religious conflict, and operating in a world vastly different from our own. Judging him solely by modern standards misses the nuances of his story and the forces that drove his actions.
That's a really valuable insight. It's so easy to fall into the trap of presentism, judging historical figures by our own contemporary values. But to truly understand Drake, we have to step back and see him through the lens of his own era.
Precisely. And while we can't condone all of his actions, like his involvement in the slave trade, we can strive to understand the complexities of his character and the forces that shaped his life.
Well, this deep dive has been a fascinating exploration of a complex and enigmatic figure. We've seen the daring adventurer, the ruthless commander, the devout Protestant, the controversial hero, and perhaps somewhere beneath all those layers, there's a glimpse of a man who, in his own way, wrestled with the forces of good and evil.
Ultimately, the question of whether Drake made a deal with the devil remains unanswered. But perhaps in the end, it's not the answer that matters, but the journey of exploration and understanding that the question itself inspires.
Well said. And for our listener, we hope this deep dive has provided some food for thought, some new perspectives on this enduring historical enigma. And who knows, maybe they'll uncover some new piece of evidence that sheds even more light on this fascinating question.
Until then, may your own explorations of history be filled with curiosity, critical thinking, and a willingness to embrace the complexities of the past.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, happy exploring.